Hi, this is Dr. Zach London from the University of Michigan Department of Neurology, and today I'm going to show you some of the basic features of EMG Whiz, which can be found at www.emgwhiz.com. EMG Whiz is an interactive EMG and nerve conduction study simulator designed to teach and assess electrodiagnostic problem-solving skills. EMG Whiz uses cases and lets you work through the step-by-step process of diagnosing disorders of the peripheral nervous system using EMG data, just as you would with a real patient. So let's log in and see how it works. There are two modes, training mode and testing mode. And for the purposes of this demonstration, we're only going to use training mode, which has more features available to the learner. So you can see there are 4 different ways to choose cases. You can do it randomly. You can select by chief complaint, which would be, for instance, if you want to look for cases of wrist drop. You can look by specific diagnosis, and I don't know why you would want to do that too often, because part of the point of doing this is that you don't know the diagnosis, but I just want to show you this here to see how many different cases we have built in. And remember also, each of these, while being unique from the other cases in terms of the diagnosis, is also going to be unique every time you run the program because the data actually changes, so you never see the same case twice. But for the complete curriculum, I actually recommend using select case by module and working through the modules in order. So we're going to look at module 1, which is ulnar distribution numbness. Each module has 3 to 6 cases in which the history is very similar, but the EMG and nerve conduction study data are all different, typically going from easiest to hardest. Let's pick one from the middle here for the demonstration. First thing that happens is we get a very limited clinical history. The clinical information provided in the cases is intentionally ambiguous so that it's impossible to hone in on a single diagnosis before performing electrodiagnostic studies. EMG Whiz asks you to provide a differential diagnosis. Now in training mode you don't have to do this, but it's recommended. Just like in a real life situation, it's best to have a hypothesis and then be able to test it. So in this case, the patient has numbness in the 4th and 5th digits and weakness in hand grip. So the first thing that I would probably think of would be an ulnar mononeuropathy at the elbow. So we'll add that to our differential diagnosis. And the other thing that could present like this, that's fairly common, would be a C8-T1 radiculopathy. Now, there are other things that could present like this and that we probably should be thinking of, but let's say that I'm sort of a beginner to intermediate level electromyographer and this is all I can come up with. So I'll put those into my differential diagnosis and begin the case. So the first thing it does is it takes me to the Nerve Conduction Studies tab, which you can see up here. You can always go back and look at the case later. Now I can choose to perform over 100 conventional nerve conduction studies, including sensory and motor responses, F responses, H reflexes, blink reflexes. Once you've done motor responses, you can do repetitive stimulation. And you can look at any nerve in any case, and it'll only give you the data that you're looking for. So in this case, the symptoms are on the left, so we're going to start looking in the left arm, and I'm going to just look at a median sensory response stimulating at the wrist. That's got a nice amplitude and latency. Now let's look at an ulnar sensory response stimulating at the wrist. And that actually has a pretty low amplitude. Now I'm going to switch to my motor responses, and I'm going to do a median motor also at the wrist. And that is okay. We'll do a conduction by doing a stimulation at the elbow. Conduction velocity there is borderline, but not too bad. Now we're going to go look at an ulnar motor response stimulating at the wrist. And then we're going to march up to below the elbow, also ulnar motor response. Okay, normal amplitude, normal conduction velocity. We'll also look above the elbow to see if there's any entrapment at the elbow. And it looks like there is not. That conduction velocity is actually even a little faster across the elbow than it is before, which makes my original theory of this being related to an ulnar mononeuropathy at the elbow a little bit less likely. We'll check out an ulnar F response as well. And that is okay. That looks all right. And really, the point is you do your best to focus the study based on your differential diagnosis, but you have to be prepared to change the plan if you find something unexpected, just like in real life. So now let's say that's all I feel like doing for our nerve conduction studies, and we're going to go and click this here, the Needle EMG tab. Now here, I can choose from over 130 different muscles to examine. We'll go to the upper extremities there. And it'll provide data about abnormal spontaneous activity and motor unit morphology. So the first thing I'm going to do is go right for the money here and look at an ulnar innervated hand muscle, the first dorsal interosseous of the hand. And it gives us data about positive waves, fibrillations, recruitment is decreased, amplitude, duration, polyphasia. Now as you see, it's not showing EMG waveforms. It doesn't do that. The purpose of EMG Whiz is learning to think like an electromyographer and develop EMG reasoning skills, not to interpret EMG waveforms. There are a number of other excellent resources for waveform interpretation if that's what you're looking for. So in this case, I've looked at a number of upper extremity limb muscles, and I found what looks like neurogenic, acute and chronic changes in two ulnar innervated muscles as well as a median innervated muscle, but with sparing of the triceps. I'm also going to go and look at a paraspinal at about the C8 level, and that one is normal. Okay, so now let's try to solve the puzzle. I have a patient with denervation in all these muscles supplied by the C8 and T1 nerve roots other than the paraspinals, and a low ulnar sensory response. Even though I wasn't really thinking about it when I made my differential diagnosis, I now think this patient probably has a lower trunk brachial plexopathy. So let's click on Solve up here, and let's enter that. We'll say plexopathy, lower trunk brachial, problems on the left. And as you see, if I want to, I can enter a second diagnosis. Some of these cases, just like in real life, people have more than one thing going on. They might have a radiculopathy plus neuropathy or something like that. But in this case, I think there's only one problem. So I'm going to click on Solve Puzzle and see what EMG Whiz has to say. And now here's where EMG Whiz is particularly powerful. It actually analyzes my study design and conclusions and gives me in-depth feedback. So first of all, it says here's what the correct diagnosis was. Left lower trunk brachial plexopathy, and guess what? That's what I said. So my diagnosis was correct. But then it says, did you perform the studies necessary to rule this in, to actually prove this diagnosis? And here it's saying the answer is no. So I can click here to find out what nerve conduction studies or what needle EMG studies I would have needed to do to rule in this diagnosis, and it highlights things that I could have done that would have gotten me there. And in this case, it wanted me to do a left medial antebrachial cutaneous sensory response, because that should have been abnormal in a lower trunk brachial plexopathy. I can also open up an extended discussion down here and learn about lower trunk brachial plexopathy, including the expected clinical and electrodiagnostic features of a lesion at that localization. And finally, at the bottom, there are a few other teaching pearls under additional discussion. The third type of feedback that EMG Whiz gives me is whether or not I actually did a good job excluding everything else that was on the differential diagnosis. Remember, even if you rule in the correct diagnosis, you still have to rule out other diagnoses in your differential. To view that, I'm going to click on the Differential Diagnosis Discussion tab up here. On the left, it shows the differential diagnosis that I came up with at the beginning, and in the right column it shows the complete differential, and including in bold the things that I missed. Then below it goes through each diagnosis in the differential and whether I actually performed enough tests to rule it out. As you see, for instance, I did enough things to rule out a C8-T1 radiculopathy, but it wasn't happy with my ability to rule out a medial cord brachial plexopathy. So I can now click here to find out what additional studies I would have needed to do to rule this diagnosis out. In this case, EMG Whiz recommends performing needle EMG of either the extensor indicis or the extensor pollicis longus. Now these are innervated by axons that pass through the lower trunk, but not the medial cord. Right? They're supplied by the radial nerve, which comes off the posterior cord. So if we had checked these, we would have found denervation changes, and that would have proven that the problem was proximally in the lower trunk. And of course, for each of these, I can also open up an extended discussion about, in this case, the medial cord brachial plexopathy, and this discussion focuses on the clinical and electrodiagnostic features that distinguish it from the diagnosis in this case, a lower trunk brachial plexopathy. So that's basically it. Check out our other video to learn about some of the advanced features of EMG Whiz. so you can get the most out of your experience. Thanks again for joining me and for your interest in EMG Whiz. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me at zach, Z-A-C-H, at emgwiz.com.